about change. I want to start with a pop quiz. What year is this from? Just call it out. 1880. 19-something, 10, 20? 2016. Did I hear today? 2016? Good guesses. Yeah, you did exactly what every audience all around the world always does, which is guess a range of about 200 years. It's actually, in fact, from 1910, so points to someone over here. This is an old railroad org chart, one of the first, actually, railroad org charts in existence. And it's over 100 years old. And what I find fascinating about that is that if I had shown you a shoe or a house or a dress or a telephone from 100 years ago and asked how old it was, you'd be pretty accurate in your carbon dating of it. But I show you the main visual instrument by which we illustrate all of human labor, and we have no idea when it's from. It hasn't changed at all. So the world has changed in almost every way. We have rockets that can land themselves, and this is the same. So I find that really, really interesting. Now here's another interesting thing. These are some ideas about how to work that I found a few years ago and that I found very, very interesting. And I want to sort of get a sense in the room of if you've ever seen this before in a workplace. Maybe you've seen it in the workplace you're in today, or perhaps you have seen it in a prior role. So let's see here. Insist on doing everything through channels. Never permit shortcuts to be taken, right? So we have to kind of do things by the book. Whenever possible, refer all matters to committees. Never fewer than 5 people. Make the committees as large as possible. Haggle over the precise wordings of communications and all employee emails and ads that are going to go out and everything we're doing with communication. Referring back to matters from the last meeting and kind of reopening and relitigating decisions that get made. And then, of course, my personal favorite as a coach and an advisor to companies, multiplying the procedures and clearances involved in issuing instructions, paying checks, and so on, right? See that 3 people have to approve something where 1 would do. How many people in the audience, by show of hands, have ever seen this kind of behavior at work? Okay, there's a lot of hands up for those of you that can't see. What do you think this is from? The Oss Sabotage Manual, 1940s. Boom. The Oss Sabotage Manual. This is from the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA. And the head of the CIA at that time created a document to sort of help with people that were sympathetic to the Allies in the war, people that were inside enemy states. And this is how they could sabotage the companies that they worked at. These were the rules. There's actually about 17 of them in there. I've got an old copy of this myself. And this was how to sabotage a business, is to behave in this way. And so somehow in the last 75 years, we've gone from this to sabotage being business as usual, which I find really, really troubling. Now, the question I always ask when I see things like this is how did we get here, right? And how do we move forward? The interesting thing is that we weren't always like this, right? We started in a merchant economy, a craft economy, an artisan economy, and here we have an old cordwainer. When you were a cordwainer back then, you were running the shop. You created and designed the shoes. You manufactured them yourself. You were customer service. You swept the floor at the end of the night, right? So you did everything, and it was a master and apprentice model. So you mastered the art, and then you taught the next generation, and they sort of worked at your feet, no pun intended, until it was their time to take over or to start their own shop. And that's great, except if you have Napoleonic Wars going on and you need 40,000 boots in a week, what do you do? Because the fact is that these cordwainers could only make about 1 pair of shoes a day. So there's a huge supply and demand problem. Now along comes our friend, Frederick Winslow Taylor, and he has an idea. It's a great idea, and he has a bunch of contemporaries that have similar ideas, and they say, you know what? The way we fix this problem is it looks a little bit more like this. Whoops. A little bit more like this, right? And what we'll do is we'll separate the thinking from the doing. Separate the thinking from the doing so that we can measure and stopwatch and figure out the exact perfect way to do every step. So instead of having one person make the whole shoe, this person will thread the shoelace, this person will punch the holes, this person will rivet the sole, right? And it has a bunch of huge advantages, because one of the advantages is, in the old model, if you brought a bunch of 50 master cordwainers into the room and said, make a bunch of shoes, first of all, they wouldn't make any more shoes than they made alone. And second, if one of them said, oh, you know what, I want to raise, well, how are you going to replace a master cordwainer? You can't just walk out on the street and find one. And so you have to have experts. Same thing goes for, if somebody gets sick, how are you going to replace them for the day? But in this model, they could go out on the street and grab literally anyone and say, you want a job? I'll pay you the minimum amount, and your job is to put shoelaces in holes. And what's amazing, and why Freddie there has a party hat on, is that it worked really well. Right? Like almost everything that we enjoy about convenience and scale and affordability and consistency in our modern world is the result of this scientific management, this idea that we can separate the thinking from the doing. But what's fascinating is that inadvertently, while sort of standardizing and creating this model, they also created a new class of people with a new role, and that new class of people was called managers. And the manager's job was to do the thinking and figure out how to refine and change this process, and everyone else's job was to execute and get it done. And it worked incredibly, incredibly well. I'm not going to say it's the most humanist experience in the world if you were working in one of these factories, but it did raise the standard of living for everyone on Earth. And if you look at the recent data, almost all the statistics are sort of saying that it's a better time to be alive than it was a couple hundred years ago. Personal politics notwithstanding, and there's a lot of benefits that came from it. Unfortunately, about 30, 40 years ago, it stopped working as well, and nobody really noticed. No one paid attention. And what we find is that things like corporate mortality, so the amount of time that a company is alive and on the market, is trending down from about 50, 60 years in the late 1950s, early 1960s, to an average now on the S&P at least of about 15. And it's on its way to 12, and we can kind of predict where it may go from there. And that just means it's harder than ever to stay relevant, to stay alive, to stay big and important. You literally can follow the S&P, and every 2 weeks on average going forward, someone's going to fall off, either because they got acquired or because they went out of business. So there's a lot of consolidation going on and a lot of disruption there. And then we're also getting less efficient. So you can look at things that can be manipulated, right, in the market. You can look at share prices and things like that that are driven on a more irrational basis. But return on assets is a pretty tough metric to game, and it's been trending down as well for the last 40, 50 years. We are literally doing less with more, right? So we have these huge monolithic organizations. They're trying to figure out how to meet their quarterly growth goals. They cut out some of their internal functions and innovation and divergence in order to do that. They kind of trim the fat. They amazingly hit their profit target. They hit their quarter, and then they go, shit, now how are we going to innovate? I know what we'll do. We'll go buy someone innovative, and so they do M&A, and they bring that in. It doesn't work as well as they expect. They're more bureaucratic. They're bigger. Their ROA continues to go down, and this goes on and on and on and on at a company level and at an economic level. And it's not just about the numbers, right? The numbers are compelling if you're an economist, but if you're a human being, it feels like this, right? We know from stats, and this is both here in the States and in Europe, that we have people that are, routinely disengaged. Half the people are not engaged, sort of working for the weekend. 16% of the people are actively disengaged, which is sort of defined as that sabotage we talked about earlier. And, on the other side, you got half the people that are unhappy in their job or kind of looking around the corner for the next one. So you can imagine in your daily life, if you go into a store, 2 out of 3 people don't want to be there. 2 out of 3 people in this audience may not want to be in the job that they're in. This is totally unacceptable, right? If this is the pinnacle of human achievement, we've really missed the mark. So, what the heck is happening, right? What is going on that Taylor's model has fallen apart for us, right? Why it gave us all these gains, it gave us all this upside, and then slowly but surely it started to fail. And I think the reason is that we now are inundated with bureaucracy. It's probably part of the reason a lot of you are here. And bureaucracy is a reaction. Bureaucracy is a Band-Aid. It's a methodology of trying to gain control of something, right? The way we're going to control this thing and keep it held to the center and make it work is we're going to add rules and regulations and policies and roles, and we're going to root power in the places where we know that it can be held safely and predictably. And bureaucracy, I think, is a reaction to, and sort of an inappropriate reaction to, complexity. It is treating the complex like it's complicated. And so we come to the part here where we have to talk about the difference between these two words. Because in almost every organization I've worked with, in almost any room that I've been in, and we start to talk about these things, most people treat them as synonyms, right? They are the same. They talk about a problem space. Oh, it's super complicated. You wouldn't want to hear about it. Oh, it's very complex. You wouldn't understand it, right? We treat them as synonyms. But they're not synonyms. They have very distinct meanings. If you talk to a systems theorist, these things are starting to really come clear in terms of what they stand for, right? So let's talk about what they are. We'll do another quick pop quiz. So here we have a couple different systems. On the left, we have a watch. So show of hands, who thinks a watch is complicated? And who thinks it's complex? Okay. And what about the engine? We have the engine on the right here. Show of hands for complicated. Okay, some tentative ones. And complex? Some more. All right, so you're doing roughly 50-50. All right, let's look at another set. What about weather? Show of hands for weather. Complicated? Complex? Okay, and what about the traffic? Complicated? And complex. Okay, so once again, you've done what every audience all over Earth does, which is, as a group at least, we're kind of like, I don't know. I'm gonna throw my hand up. I'm gonna see what other people are doing. I'm sure some of you know, and you're thinking like, these guys don't know. I know. But the reality is, as a culture, we don't know, and as a business culture, we don't know, which is a huge problem, right? Because this defines how we engage with the problems that surround us. So let's talk about the reality from the systems theory perspective. These systems right here are complicated. Complicated in the sense that they are causal. They are linear systems. There is cause and effect. They will not surprise us 99 times out of 100. And you can go get expertise and experts that understand these systems. So if you have a broken watch or a car that won't work, you can go to someone who's trained, who has expertise in that space, and they will almost 100% reliably be able to fix it. They will find the part that is missing, and they will put it in the place that it is needed. And so these systems are causal. They have all these pieces that fit together. They're not simple. They're not easy. I mean, I have no earthly idea how my car works. It is well beyond my expertise, but there are people that do, and they can fix it for me. These systems, on the other hand, are a little bit different, right? These are complex systems, and in that sense, they are dispositional. They are not causal. They are somewhat chaotic, right? There's an element of chance and interaction. They have so many different agents in them that how they're going to unfold is essentially unpredictable. There's no computer on Earth that can give you a down-to-the-second prediction of what's going to happen with the weather or a down-to-the-minute prediction of what's going to happen with traffic. Sometimes you put 5 cars on the 405 at 6 p.m. and they get soaked right up. Another time you put 5 cars on and the thing is a 3-hour standstill. Right? And nobody can predict that. We can get close because they have a disposition. They have a way they are going. We can sort of say, like, it looks like rain today. That is the disposition of the weather. It may rain around 1. It may rain about 0.1 inches at 1. And the closer we get to the moment, the closer we can get to discerning that pattern. But they surprise us, right? These systems surprise us. We are seeing surprises that are catastrophic in California right now. We have seen surprises in weather around the world that suggest that maybe something's going on. And other complex systems surprise us too. One of my favorite complex systems is young children, for those of you that have them. You can try to get them to grow up and be well-adjusted adults that go on to become doctors or whatever you desire them to be. But they could go a million different ways. And sometimes the push helps, and sometimes it hurts, and sometimes being stern is the right move, and sometimes being warm and kind is the right move, and we never know, right? It is a constant push and pull. And with complex systems, you don't solve a problem, right? You can't solve a complex problem in the same way that you can't be like, I'm going to solve raising kids. You manage a complex problem. You interact with it. You inform your beliefs and your understanding of it through interaction. And a lot of what is interesting about the topic today is, it's through that validation, it's through that experimentation that we find out more about the complex systems that we work with. Okay, so the big question is then, what does this mean for organizations? Right? This is the question. So if we now understand the difference between complicated and complex in a more sophisticated way, what does that mean for our organizations? And I think what it means is this. Organizations are fairly complex. When you put 10,000, 100,000, even 100 people together around a purpose and you say go, there's a lot of interaction. There's a lot of randomness. There's a lot of relationships and influence and nuance that's going to unfold. It is not a watch. Putting a set of posters on the wall that say our values are X, Y, and Z is not going to change the minds and behavior of 100,000 people. That is pure folly. That is treating the complex like it's complicated. Now, there are complicated tasks in a business for sure. Right? If I FedEx a package today, there's a very high likelihood that it will arrive tomorrow where I want it to arrive. That is a complicated problem with some complexity at the edges of it. Right? But when I talk about culture change, when I talk about changing how we work, how we innovate, how we solve problems, how we sort of step into the future, that is a complex domain. And that means that we have to bring the right approach to it. And that is really the takeaway here. So, what that means is that we have to answer the question of what kind of a way of working, what kind of an operating system do we need? So, to manage complexity, we need a different operating system. And I use the phrase operating system kind of loosely. I use it as a catch-all term. But what I mean is, in the same way that there are simple rules and basic foundational sort of assumptions in the phone in your pocket or in the DNA in your cells, there are foundational assumptions and principles and practices in our businesses too that make up an operating system. They make up the bedrock, the foundation upon which we do our work. And if we don't change that, we're really not going to get anywhere, right? And so I want to start with an example of the power of an operating system. So here's the same problem space, right? We have two roads crossing, and we have to make sure the cars don't hit each other while we maximize the throughput of the intersection. And these are two different operating systems, two different approaches and assumptions about human behavior. On the left, we have the lighted intersection. On the right, we have the roundabout. Now, the lighted intersection has some assumptions. What do you think those assumptions are? Yeah. Basically, we need rules, we need guidelines, we need to be told, we can't be trusted. We have to be looking at the signals. And of course, the signals and the apparatus that's going to control us here has a huge organization behind it, right? Someone has to install that, maintain it. There's a central control center. There's software that runs that. It's an incredible apparatus. What about on the right? What are the assumptions of the right? You'll figure it out. Just get on in there. You'll figure it out, right? It assumes a measure of personal responsibility, of judgment. And it's actually run on simple rules, right? The first rule is go in the same direction as the people in the circle. The second rule is give the right of way to the people in the circle and slip in when you can find an opening. Which of these do you think is safer? The roundabout, yeah. It's about 80 to 90% safer, and when you start talking about fatality collisions, it's dramatically safer. Which of these has higher throughput? Roundabout also has close to 80% higher throughput. Which of these is cheaper to build and maintain? Roundabout. Which of these works better when the power goes out? You don't have to answer that one. So which of these do we have more of in the United States and actually in the world at large? The intersection, right? The lighted intersection. There are 1,114 lighted intersections for every one roundabout in the United States. 1,000 to 1 preference. And when I ask most people casually, which do you feel safer in, which do you prefer, which drives you crazy and which one doesn't, they prefer the lighted intersection. They're like, oh yeah, that feels safer and I can check my phone while I'm sitting there, right? I don't have to be focused. I don't have to be present. So we have this thing that we prefer, but is demonstrably, measurably worse in almost every context. Of course, yes, if you're in Manhattan and you need to put 15 of these things in a square mile, then yeah, land use dictates that a roundabout's not the right play. There are situations where the complicated solution matters, where it's appropriate. I'm not saying there are no situations for that. But in the vast majority of situations, the roundabout is a superior way to solve the problem. And the operating system that is behind it is one of trust. It's one of autonomy, right? So we can sort of compare these two ways of working really quite simply this way. Control and compliance versus trust and autonomy. And every time that we look at our operating system in organizations, we make a choice. Are we going to choose the lighted intersection approach or are we going to choose the roundabout approach? When we do a budget, we are choosing an approach. When we do a performance review, we are choosing an approach. Now, a lot of it's inherited. We don't even think about it. Most teams I talk to, I'm like, yeah, when's the last time you thought deeply about the right way to develop people in terms of a performance review? And they're like, yeah, no time for that. Like, I just do whatever the party line is here, and we try to get through it and move on. And yeah, maybe I think it's stupid, but it's not my job to fix it, right? So we don't think deeply about our operating system, but this choice is always there for us. It's always present. And the operating system has a lot of different spaces. So in the research that we recently did for the book, for Brave New Work, we found that there are about 12 spaces where if you go talk to organizations that are working in new ways, that have made their organization a bit more of a roundabout, they start talking about new practices and principles in these areas, in terms of how they orient and steer, in terms of authority and how they use and share power, in terms of structure, in terms of strategy, workflow, mastery, how they grow and mature people, comp, information flow, right? Membership, the idea of what am I part of and how do I move between the membranes of teams and departments and organizations as a whole. And so these are kind of the spaces where we have to make these choices and where we make them either implicitly and without thinking, or we make them deliberately as leaders and as teams. And what's interesting is there are organizations out there that have made very unusual choices. So for example, we have Handelsbanken, which is a Swedish bank that I was actually standing there just a little while ago in 20-degree weather. What's amazing about them is in the 70s, they had just come through a financial crisis, and the new CEO that was appointed for a very disruptive set of ideas. And he came in and said, you know what, all the customers interact with us at the branch level. The branch is the bank. So we're going to give authority out to the edges. We're going to decentralize the organization as much as possible. Instead of telling them what loans to make and at what rate and to whom and what products to offer, we're going to let the branches figure it out, and we're going to let them learn from each other. And so they completely decentralized the organization. Hundreds and hundreds of branches. This is, an enormous turnover company, $20 billion some odd dollars. And what was astounding is that it worked incredibly well. So well, in fact, that they really kind of went away from the traditional budgeting from the center and started just letting people make educated choices at the edge with transparency. And if you look now, for almost every downturn that we've had in the financial markets for the last 40 years, they've missed it. They didn't have that happen because they don't have people chasing bad loans for some reason that some corporate officer said they had to. They're with customers every day making those decisions. There's no central customer service hotline that you call. You literally go talk to your banker, and they're empowered to fix and change anything that you need fixed or changed. And the way they decide if they're successful is they look at the average profit over revenue of their bank versus their competitors. That's the benchmark. It's a relative target. And every year for the last 45 years, they have beaten that target. It is the highest performance, financial institution in Europe in that way, right? So incredible power from that decentralization, from kind of treating the system like a roundabout and letting the branches educate each other because it's a transparent system. If one branch has a month where they sell a lot and people are like, well, what's going on over there? They can go find out. And if it's a best practice they can learn from or an emerging practice they can learn from, they take it. Another example from Europe, Bertzorg. It's a nursing organization based in the Netherlands. This is an organization that 9 years ago had no people at it, and now is well over 14,000 nurses. It's a dominant organization, #1 rated employer in the Netherlands, above 1,000 employees. And what's fascinating here is the guy that founded it realized, you know what, nursing's a calling. He was a nurse, a home care nurse. Nursing's a calling. I don't want to be tracking down to the second the time I spend with patients and tracking down to the pill exactly what's being advocated. I want to be able to offer real human care. And so he created an organization where that was the big idea, where we would have teams in communities of roughly 8 to 12 people, and those teams would have autonomy to figure out how they delivered their care, how they measured it, how they performed, what that looked like, how they created the service that they wanted to create, how they delivered what their customers needed. And now they have a system that is so incredibly successful. And what's hilarious is the first time that you have an interaction with a Bertzorg nurse, you know what they're likely to do with you? It's not fill out paperwork. They're likely to have a cup of coffee with you. They sit down and have a cup of coffee and talk about your family, your community, your connections, who can help, what does autonomy mean to you in your health, how can they help you, sort of make progress on the goals that you hold. And after the cup of coffee, they might go have one with your neighbor and figure out how they're part of your support system, right? So there's a huge human component to this. And recently, E&Y and a couple others took a look at well, how's it working from a numbers perspective? And it turned out that on every measure they could come up with, it was as good or better as the traditional healthcare approach, and in some cases, vastly better. Saves the Dutch healthcare system billions of dollars every year because Bertzorg patients get healthy faster, and they stay healthy longer, right? So it's a total flipping of the model of kind of going from target-based, metric-based management to a more human-centric approach. And then we have another player here. So this is Morningstar. Now, this is a little bit more on the plate, so to speak. This is the world's largest tomato processor. And the folks that founded this realized that, tomato processing is not the most glamorous of professions. It's not the most interesting thing to do. And it's a little bit dehumanizing to just be working in the field and then working in the office and trying to move ketchup around. And so what we're going to do is we're going to empower people to shape their own career. And so at Morningstar, every year, every employee writes their own job description and sets their own salary. And it's called a colleague letter of understanding, or a CLUE. And every year you sit down and you think about, all right, what did I do last year? How'd that go? What am I qualified to do this year? You write that down. You explain your rationale. And then an advisory committee of elected colleagues provides you with some advice. And the advice would say, you undershot on this. You could probably do more here. You might want to make a different commitment about this role that you're planning to hold. The salary that you recommended for yourself is a little high or a little low. And, of course, the killer feature here, speaking of autonomy, is once they've gotten that advice, they can choose to take it or not take it. Now, the consequences of taking it are they have to do maybe what they weren't originally intending to do. The consequences of not taking it are social, right? When we lose top-down compliance as our form of control, we replace it with something new, something better, which is reputational and social, right? If everybody knows what I'm asking to get paid and it's inappropriately high, that's going to cost me socially. It's going to cost me reputationally, and it may even lead to someone having to, give me feedback or, conflict resolution process or something like that, right? But better to have that out in the open than not. And what's amazing about this is year after year, they don't have somebody who comes in and says, I want to get paid $200,000 to pick tomatoes. They have people asking for relatively appropriate pay for relatively appropriate work, right? Because they understand what's going on. They have transparent data about the firm's financial performance. Everything is clear to everyone, and so they're working within the bounds of that understanding, and they're growing as they do it. So if I didn't realize something about our economics when I make a request and I get good advice, I learn, right? I grow as a result of that experience. Now, a little bit more serious, we have nuclear submarines. This is the USS Santa Fe, which was a nuclear sub in the Navy a few years back that was the lowest ranked performing ship in the Navy. And the person that was put in charge of it, a guy named David Marquette, was told by his commanding officer, you will take over this low performing ship, you will fix this low performing ship, and you are not allowed to change any of the personnel on this low performing ship. So you have to work with who's there. And I love this example because so many of the clients I work with and teams I talk to are like, what the problem is our people. Our people suck. That's the problem. It's not true. It's not the fish, you guys. It's the aquarium. We are chameleons, right? So here comes David. He comes in. He's been training for another ship for years. He lands on this nuke sub that he doesn't understand at the level you have to understand to operate something that has a nuclear reactor in the back of it. And so he starts to talk to people. They come and say, Captain, what should we do? Should we dock and do this exercise? He said, well, what do you intend to do? They step back. Haven't heard that before. What do you intend to do? I don't know, sir. Well, when you figure out what you intend, come find me. So people started to realize, he's not going to tell us what to do. We have to think for ourselves about what to do. And so they'd come back. Captain, I intend to go, 72 degrees starboard and dock and do this training exercise. And he would say, very well. And they would go do that. And he did this enough that people started to realize they were accountable for their own role. They were accountable for their success. At the same time, they started to document and articulate what competence looked like on the ship. So they articulated what does it look like to have expertise, what does it look like to make good decisions, and people had two of those different feedback systems. He reserved only one decision for himself. That decision was to fire. We're not going to fire a nuke unless I say so. Everything else, what do you intend to do, right? Here's what's amazing. A couple years later, this ship, highest performing ship in the Navy, for years after, created more officers than any other ship in the Navy, right? And again, it doesn't feel like the normal military model, in the same way that what Stanley McChrystal did with JSOC didn't sound like the normal military model. But what they're realizing is the world's too dynamic. It's too fast changing. We can't run the standard top-down command and control model, even in the military anymore, even on a nuclear submarine, if we want to get these great outcomes. If we want the best out of people, we have to change the operating system, which means changing how we think about people. And last but not least, there are 80 of these that we could talk about today, but this will be the last one for now. Hire in China. Now, an appliance manufacturer, maybe you have one at home. The CEO of this company has taken them through a series of different evolutions, and the most recent one has been about eliminating bureaucracy. It's been about changing the way they organize. They took a group of about 60,000 people that were in a standard functional matrix silo BS hierarchy, and they said, what if we blew this up into autonomous teams that were solely responsible for the creation, delivery, and service of products? And they call them ZZJYTs, which is an acronym for something in Chinese that I won't even dare to try to pronounce. And they're teams of 10 to 20 people that are created from those 60,000. So now there are 2,000, and actually by today there are close to 4,000 of these independent teams that each have their own P&L, that each have their own responsibility, that are sort of out there in the world, sink or swim. You want to talk about bets. They have 4,000 bets at Hire right now that are all independently taking action in the marketplace. And what it's done is two things. One, it's turned Hire into a talent marketplace like you've never seen. So leaders for each different project are elected by the people on and around those projects. Team members are moving in their career path fluidly through different projects. As things fail, they're shuttered, people move on to other projects. It's turned the workforce into a fluid engine. Instead of saying, oh, well, if you're not the VP of customer service for this group, you're fired. They're saying, if you take a bet and it doesn't work out, kill it as soon as you can and move on to the next ZZJYT and go make a market. And they are now the fastest growing, by far, appliance manufacturer in the world. They acquired GE Appliances a couple of years ago, and what they actually did is in the space of a year, just by reorganizing this way, lifted net income and lifted revenue for the first time in a decade. So incredible success there. There's a great case study, by the way, in this month's Harvard Business Review, if you want to check that out, by Gary Hamel and Michelle Zanini. It's incredible. Okay, so that's Hire. So what's interesting about these organizations is that if you put them all together, you start to see a pattern of new mindsets. And I wanted to just briefly highlight for you what those mindsets are. So if I can get this to click here. There we go. Moving too fast. It's like bingo, isn't it? There we go. All right, a couple mindsets, right? So the first that I really detected is what I'm calling people positive, right? It's this idea that instead of thinking that we're all, in a Skinner box, behaviorist, determinist, sort of dark view of humanity, these organizations have a people positive view of humanity, meaning we do our best work when we have autonomy, when we're seeking mastery and purpose, as Dan Pink talks about from self-determination theory. And we're adaptive, we're chameleons. If you put someone in an environment that rewards individual success and silo behavior and keeping information under lock and key, and you put them in there for 30 years, pretty soon everybody's going to think Phil is kind of an asshole. Right? But he's not. He's just been in an environment that only rewards those things for so long that he's become what we all dislike, right? But what I found is that when you move people into a new system, a new ecology, within months, people completely change how they show up, right? We're very plastic. And finally, trust and respect, right? It goes back to the roundabout, that we all are worthy of that we're all capable, right? That people that work in everything from, an hourly wage job in fast food to, running the space station are capable of managing their own development, their own growth, their own career path, their own compensation, the nature of their role. With the right advice, they're capable of doing great things. And then on the other side, the other mindset that's almost a little bit in tension with this is complexity conscious, right? So this is about allowing for emergence and thinking about the nature of the context we're in. Is it a complicated domain? Is it a simple one? Is it a chaotic one? Is it complexity? And if it is, then what's the right constraints, right? So governing constraints like a stoplight are only going to make sense in complicated and simple spaces where we know the rules, where we know the checklist. And enabling constraints that set us up to find and use judgment and make something that wouldn't happen otherwise, like the simple rules of the roundabout, are appropriate in complexity. And so we need leaders and we need teams that are complexity conscious, that are aware of the nature of the spaces in which they're operating and choosing the right tools for the job. If all you have is a hammer, you're banging nails all day. We need a broader set of tools in our toolbox, and that's what these have been all about. Now, so those are sort of the takeaways. What I find when I talk to teams next is they say, great, I buy it, Aaron, it's wonderful. Let's change. But here's the problem about change. Just like we have the wrong ideas about the nature of organizations, we also have the wrong ideas about the nature of change. This is how we think about change in corporate America today. This is sort of based on the Virginia Satir model. It is status quo, resistance, chaos, tripping, and then you sort of climb your way back out to the new status quo, which hilariously is like 0.5 inches higher than the original status quo. This is change management done top down, right? It looks like it sucks. It's critical, it is negative, it tells a story of something that does not feel like this person is in control of what's happening, right? It's happening to them, and that's an issue. And of course, maybe this isn't the model that you use. Maybe you can afford a really good consulting company. And so this is what your model looks like. It's in 3 dimensions, right? And it's got more words and stuff connected to it. If this is how human beings change, we're in a world of trouble, right? There's so much going on here that we're trying to sort of describe the complex like it's complicated. We're trying to turn it into a watch by having all these stages and steps, and the steps thing drives me crazy because let's say you're changing an organization of 20,000 people. You're telling me that everybody is in the visualize stage at the same time? Have you ever even had a dinner party and just looked at the emotional maturity of the people there? We're all over the place always, and we're in different cultures and contexts and moments, and our projects are going well and poorly. We're not on the same page. Change is not a pretty picture. It is not linear. And so we have to reinvent it if we're going to be successful. And by the way, I'm not just complaining with no data. As I'm sure you all have seen, 80% of all change efforts fail by almost every measure you can put to them. And when you ask people at the edge, if you ask people on the front lines if a change effort worked, only 6% say yes. So it's just not working. It's just money spent and agony trying to get to a future that doesn't exist. So instead, let's change how we change, right? And there's a different way to think about it that I think is both freeing and ultimately challenging in the same way that the Roundabout is, right? You're not on your phone waiting for something to happen. You're in the circle figuring it out for yourself. So here's a few rules for that change that I think will really get you a lot of mileage and that we have seen in this work, working with dozens and dozens of organizations over the last couple of years, real fruitful progress from. The first is through them, not to them. As much respect as I have for Satya, and he would agree, I think, with this point, it's not about some leader being brought in who's going to bring the answers, right? These are the answers, and this is the new org chart, and this is how it's going to work, and let's push it out and make everybody walk to that tune. There are moments of chaos and disorder where things are so severely broken that we have to grab the reins and do triage. Those moments exist, but 9 out of 10 moments are not that moment. They are the moment where the system itself has to learn by doing. And this is a real team in Europe figuring out how to change the way they work with ping pong balls. And it's ridiculous, but it works. They're actually talking, thinking, noticing for the first time in years how they work together, how they serve each other, how they don't, where they're going to go, what they're going to change, how they're going to do it differently. That agency, that autonomy is built into our DNA. We need that in order to grow and change. And so through them, not to them is a big one just at the very top of any change effort. The second one is learn by doing. So I spend so much time in meetings where we want to make the plan. Where's the plan for how this change is going to go? We want to be agile and lean and different, and we need that plan so that we know how it's going to go. But again, it's a complex system, right? The plan is a lie committed to paper. It's not going to get us anywhere. You can draw pictures of a bike all day. That is not riding a bike. Riding a bike is riding a bike. And I have a picture here of my son, Huxley. He's on his balance bike, which is an innovation that didn't exist when I was a kid. And the balance bike says, it's not the pedaling that's riding a bike, it's actually the balance part. And so let's just get the pedals out there and let the kids use their legs and feel the joy and the challenge of riding and being balanced from the first moment on the bike. And I cannot tell you, I mean, those of you that have kids have seen this probably, they learn so much faster than we did. I mean, it is night and day, and it's because they're learning by doing. So when it comes to new ways to make decisions, new ways to fund, new ways to innovate, new ways to, meet, to share information, new tools, we always say, can we just default to doing? Can we just try this and then debate about it and then talk about how we loved it or hated it, rather than debate before we try? So that's learn by doing. Third is smart small. It's so hard in big organizations where everybody wants to be doing the big thing that moves the needle, right? If you're in a $100 million company, a 1% move is a $1 million decision, right? Change doesn't work that way. It starts with small moves, with teams that are willing, with people that are volunteers, that are invited in, and it spreads when it's good. If your change isn't spreading on its own, your change is no good, right? It's as simple as that. So start small and look for what spreads. That's the experiment. That's sort of the lean startup inside your change model. Fourth example, and one of my personal favorites, is start by stopping. Start by stopping is amazing because, I don't know if anyone's ever looked in a kitchen drawer or a garage lately, but we stink at getting rid of stuff. We stink at it. This is a real client calendar from one of my actual clients where the management team's average number of meetings per week was 45 hours. 45 hours a week of meetings, including over the lunch hour. They had no time to eat. And then what they talked about in terms of tension was, we don't really have time for strategy. Of course you don't. You're spending 45 hours a week in meetings. We tried an experiment. The experiment was, are you willing for 2 weeks to stop all meetings and just see where it hurts? What do you miss? What are you missing that you aren't getting when you turn it all the way off? So start by stopping can make the space for the change that actually needs to happen. Instead of always adding something to the mix, what if we take away and leave space for people to figure it out, right? Leave space for people to say, oh, you know what, I really wish we had a meeting about this product or vision, or I wish we had a time that we could go out to lunch and socialize, and now they have the space to try that out, to step into that world. And last but not least, and I think critical for change agents these days, is join the resistance. So there is a mental model we have about people that are not ready to play, which is that they are behind the line, and they are laggards, and they're dinosaurs, and they don't get it, and all this kind of stuff. It's BS. They are not changing because your change approach stinks. They are not changing because it doesn't make sense for them to change yet in their view. So there is information trapped there. There is user feedback trapped there. And so the first thing that we try to do when we find resistors is go sit with them and say, hi, first of all, I'm not here to convince you to change. I'm here to learn from you so I can make my change effort, my product, better. And my question is, what would it take? What would have to be different for you to get involved? And often we'll hear important answers like, oh, love all this stuff you're talking about, but my incentives tell me to do this other thing. So until you change my incentives, you're really putting me at odds with myself. Very good feedback. Let's go work on that. And the OS gives us a chance to say, we have to play across all these spaces. So when we talk with leaders, we're saying it's not just about autonomy or authority or structure or teams. It might be about comp. It might be about information flow. It might be about workflow. It might be about structure. So join the resistance and invite them to help you make it better. 9 times out of 10, if you have someone start listing for you the ways they can make your change management better, they will talk themselves into playing along. By the end of the meeting, they're like, all right, so I'm going to lead this part and I'm going to do this part, and you're off to the races. So join the resistance. What we're talking about here at the end of the day is a very simple loop. It's a very simple loop. I call it continuous participatory change because it's always happening. We're never done. The world is too high dynamics for any org design to ever be finished anymore, so let that go. We're all in a change state. It's participatory because every team has the right to define and shape its own way of working, right? Every team has that right. And of course, the way it works is you start with tension. The first question I ask every team we work with is, what's stopping you from doing the best work of your lives? What's stopping you from doing the best work of your lives? Because it's the only question that matters. And the answers might be, we have too many meetings. The answers might be, my boss doesn't understand what we're doing. The answer might be, I don't have the information I need. Whatever it is, we find out and we start there. What is a new practice that we can install on this team and this team alone that would help move us in the direction of solving for that tension? X, Y, and Z. We go try it. We experiment. We notice what are the learning metrics, what are the steering metrics, what are the ways that we will find out if this is serving us. And then we come back and start again. What's the tension now? What's holding us back now? There's always something that can be improved. There's always a new way forward. And this becomes the second job of the team. Their first job is to do their work, to fulfill their purpose. But their second meta job is to continually refine their way of working, to be at their best so that we can achieve these really crucially important purposes that we have. We have a climate in crisis. We have a political system in crisis. We have, as you just saw, corporations in crisis, right? The world needs people that are capable of doing this in every team and every level. And we do that by inviting it. Now, I'm going to leave you with one simple thought. In the 1960s, this was the way the high jump was done. For those of you in the audience that are gentlemen, you can see how precarious this is. And, you had the scissor, the western roll, there were all kinds of different moves, but it was always face first. And there were good reasons for it. They didn't have big pads back then on the ground, etc. But along came this guy that you're all probably familiar with by the name of Dick Fosbury, right? And Dick came along and he was like, hey, I got a new idea. We're going to go over backwards. And everybody said, Dick, that'll never work. You should cut that out. You should train differently. And then they started to notice that it was working for Dick, and it was delivering outcomes for him. And he went to the 1968 Olympics and won the gold medal with it. And everybody was like, yeah, works for Dick, but it's not for us. His teammates at Oregon were like, yeah, we can't really figure this thing out. Everybody said, works for Dick, not for us. In the same way that people in the world right now and people in this audience right now are like, makes sense for Buurtzorg, makes sense for Haier, makes sense for Handelsbanken, doesn't make sense for my company. The reality is that now, as we stand here today, 40, 50 years later, we know that no single world record holder, no single gold medal winner since then has won with anything other than the flop. That it took time, it took risk, it took acclimation before people figured out how to make it work for them, and that it wasn't just about Dick, it was about a greater revolution that's happening. This is what's going on in our world of work right now. This is what I invite you to. Go over backwards, close your eyes, trust, take the leap. There's an enormous set of benefits and values on the other side, the least of which is that we get to go faster, do more, and feel more human. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you.
Y'all, I'm shook.